Mower, and I'm the head of training and development at the U.S. Agency for Global Media in Washington, D.C. Most of you may know us because we run the Voice of America, which we broadcast into Mongolia. I'm delighted to be with you here today to discuss a really important topic, not just in Mongolia, but around the world. And it has to do with and misinformation surrounding coronavirus and COVID-19. So let's discuss first the difference between disinformation and misinformation. So typically governments define information as false information that's intended to mislead. It's usually put out by governments, it's often propaganda, and the intent is to mislead foreign populations. Misinformation is false information that is spread, whether or not there is an intent to mislead. We've had a huge upsurge of misinformation in the COVID-19 epidemic because there are so many false cures. So often misinformation has a commercial element. So let's look at why people would target Mongolia. First, your location. You're nestled between Russia and China in an incredibly strategic location. Secondly, Mongolia has somewhat of a chaotic media environment. You're a young country, you're a young democracy, and media has not fully evolved. And so many of your media organizations have political affiliations. And that's a challenge for the Mongolian public. Third, you're a very internet savvy country. Although you're small with just over 3 million residents, more than 80% of Mongolians are on the internet, and that's a huge number. And as we'll learn further down the line, false information is often being spread through social media. And fourth, Mongolia has close ties with the West. The United States and other European countries have been fully supportive of Mongolia's democratic efforts and its efforts to create a vibrant market economy. So let's look at who's spreading disinformation and why they're doing this. There have been numerous reports in the United States and from the European Union and other organizations that have demonstrated that the major players in disinformation, that means government-sponsored propaganda aimed at foreign populations, the two major players are Russia and China. They have two different motives. Generally, the Russians are looking to undermine public trust in Western countries, sow panic in the world, and breed distrust among populations. The Russians have been doing this for a long time. They are masters of disinformation, and the US intelligence agencies have also indicated that they played a role in the American election of 2016. And no one is immune from disinformation from the Russians. China, on the other hand, has a motive that's very directly related to coronavirus. As we all know, it's pretty clear that the virus began in Wuhan sometime in late 2019. And there was a lot of effort from the Chinese not to reveal the nature of this and the severity of this epidemic. As a result, the Chinese are now playing catch up. They're trying to convince the world that they actually did a very good job of handling coronavirus, that they locked down their populations, which they did, and that they've given aid to other countries. So this is their intent. Now, a third player on the disinformation front is Iran. They're a smaller country, obviously, but they're a country that's suffering terribly because European and American countries have put them under sanction for their terrorist activities. So the Iranians have a clear goal to try to get sanctions removed by spreading disinformation. So here's just a quick little graphic showing the two main players in the disinformation sphere. One of the Chinese and one of the Russians. Chinese on the left, Russians on the right. And you can see that their intent to spread disinformation is different. Okay, let's look at the types of disinformation that are being spread. And I want to focus primarily on misleading medical advice, which is misinformation. Again, we're talking information, which is not spread necessarily by governments. And then information influence campaigns. So I think what we're looking at here is influence campaigns, disinformation, statistical manipulation. There's been a lot of controversy over polls and models and numbers, and it's been a big issue in the United States. Misleading medical advice, this is misinformation. Sensational news, again, misinformation. Fake news stories, and conspiracies. This is just an overview map. Later in the presentation, we have a number of sources that you can refer to, but this is a good visual put out by Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, one of the leading medical schools in the world. A lot of research and a lot of mapping of coronavirus. I think what is really interesting here is how few cases Mongolia has had. I checked today, and this might be wrong, but it said today that there's 33 cases in Mongolia and no deaths. Now, I'm, again, very wary of statistics. Journalists need to check those. I had no way of checking them. But if that's the case, that's a very low case burden on Mongolia. And your government has taken some very serious steps that have harmed your economy. So I think there's probably a lot of questions about coronavirus, as there are across the world. All right, we've looked at disinformation sponsored by governments, primarily the Chinese and the Russians. And now let's look at misin for profit and gain, because as we go through the litany of misinformation, much of this is spread by people who think that they can take advantage of Mongolian residents or American residents who are scared about this disease. They are worried, they are concerned, and they would like a quick cure. So there's a lot of misinformation about, number one, natural remedies, false cures. We've had presidents talk about drinking vodka, which is nonsense. In Africa, one of the leading political officials suggested that people drink brandy. Again, ridiculous. Number two, promoting untested drugs as a cure. This has been extremely dangerous, and there have been runs on various drugs. So again, misinformation. There are some drugs out there that look promising. There are some vaccines that are being tried. There's a lot of good information, but there's a lot of bad information. So journalists really have to be careful when they're reporting about cures and drugs and treatments. I just threw this in because it's an example of disinformation that's been in America. And the story is that the blue masks made by Amazon, delivered by Amazon, have been contaminated with toxins. Again, this is not true. It's absurd. It's a case of misinformation. And fourth is panic buying and phishing attacks. There's been a lot of a run on products here in the United States, and I'm sure there has been in Mongolia as well. Some of it really no one quite understands why there's been a run on these products. Toilet paper, we have plenty of toilet paper in the United States, and yet everybody seems to think we're running out of toilet paper, which we're not. So misinformation is, again, not a problem, not an issue just in Mongolia. We at Voice of America do a lot of work in Africa, and I would have to say that in Africa, misinformation has been extremely widespread. I just have a BBC story that I hooked up here. One of the cures that they're suggesting in Africa, which is false, is that people inhale hot steam. Of course, that is not a good idea and can actually be very harmful. So why does fake news flourish in Mongolia and in other countries? But there are some characteristics, I think, that do allow fake news to flourish. Number one, there is a distrust of government in Mongolia, often with good reason. And again, Mongolia is not alone in this. There's a distrust of government in many countries. And the way that governments have acted has been somewhat questioned by some people. I think there's no doubt that the officials around the world recommended social distancing, wearing masks, washing your hands. Those are all excellent advice, and they're backed by science. But I think a lot of governments, including Mongolia, which I understand is now put out a criminal penalty for for people who disseminate fake news, which seems a little extreme because who decides what the fake news is? So there's a great distrust of government in your country. There's also economic challenges. And again, Mongolia is not alone in this. In America, we've seen millions of people unemployed as a result of the coronavirus and the lockdown in our country. But it breeds, when people are under economic stress, this breeds a lot of fake news and people looking for solutions. Number three, and I referenced this earlier on, is the spread of social media, particularly WhatsApp. Again, Mongolians are absolutely internet savvy. 85% of you are using the internet, and social media is a very easy way to spread fake news. And the fourth is the unknowns about the virus. And I think this is a huge issue that has created an environment for fake news. No, we don't know why there are so few cases in Mongolia. We don't know why there were so many cases in New York City, but very few cases in Los Angeles. We don't know why the death rate in Africa at this point is very low. Very few Africans have died of coronavirus. We don't understand why there was a huge outbreak in Wuhan, but other cities in China did not catch this virus. We don't understand how this virus attacks the body. We don't understand why old people are more susceptible, while people who are overweight are more susceptible. But basically, we have an environment where there's very little hard scientific knowledge. That's changing quickly, but this creates a petri dish for fake news to flourish when the answers are so hard to find. So what is the media's role in ending the scourge of coronavirus and also the scourge of fake news? And I would say that you are absolutely at the forefront. You're the most important players in your country on this, in my opinion, because you are translating correct messages, correct news and information to the people, to your listeners, to your readers. And I can't emphasize how important it is that you stop disseminating bad news if you're doing it. So let's look at some ways that the media can, some ways that they can play a positive role in ending this problem of disinformation and misinformation. Number one is to basically have a public education campaign at your organizations. And again, we know what the messages are we know the correct messages on coronavirus. We know that it really does help if you stay far apart from other people. We know that wearing masks can prevent the spread of the disease. We know that washing hands is maybe the most important thing that you can do. So you have a real role to spread correct to educate the public with the correct messages. Secondly, the media has a role to encourage media literacy in your country. And media literacy basically means that everybody who reads or listens should have somewhat of a skeptical view. I don't mean hostile. I just mean that when you hear something that's not right, if you know a newspaper has a particular point of view, try to get the other side of the story. Try to think critically. And this is a skill that's being taught as young as elementary schools. Young children in America are learning media literacy, which is to be a critical thinker, to not accept everything you hear, to use your brain, to use your common sense, and to understand where you can go for various sources of information. Number three, and this is the most important, the media really has to expose disinformation. You have to call disinformation out. You cannot let disinformation flourish. And I do think that the American government has done a good job in this in some ways. One of the disinformation stories that flourished was that the American military had actually introduced the virus to China. Well, that is completely false. The virus now, it's looking pretty clear, originated in a laboratory in Wuhan. It was not an intentional issue, but it didn't start with the American military. We fought back on that, and that's your role. When you see disinformation, call it out. And number four, we're all guilty of this. Stop passing along disinformation. I keep repeating this throughout the presentation, but hit the pause button. Okay, so how to spot fake news? I thought this was a very good graphic, maybe one that you should put on your desk and refer to every time you write a story. I think it really captures how you can really help end fake news. I'm just going to run through these so that you can think about them. First off, consider the source. You know who's a trustworthy source. You know who's not. You're journalists. You're educated. You're professionals. So when you look at a source, you should be able to determine whether or not that source is accurate. Number two, check the author. And this is actually very important when you're looking at websites. Frequently, you will see someone has written an article. I seriously suggest that you Google the person's name, that you try to do some further checking, that you...
I'm on it. Okay, I found this on the web for the person's name.
Sorry. That you check the person's credentials. If you're looking at a website, go to the top right and look at the About section to see who they are, what is. Use LinkedIn, which is a very popular American site that usually is good for figuring out who someone is. Check the date. Again, very important because bad news tends to circulate quickly around the world, and it keeps circulating. So make sure that what you're reporting is up to date. At the bottom of the page here, check your biases. And I think this is really one of the hardest things for journalists to do. All of us have biases. We all have political views. We all have views about child raising, about marriage, about life. But you really need to try to set aside your own personal biases when you're writing an article, particularly one that has to do with politics. And I know that's hard, but please try to do that. Read beyond the headlines. One of the tricks of the fake players is to tease you with a provocative headline. So if you see a headline that says, President Trump is divorcing his wife, really? I think you should check on that to really make sure that that is true. Supporting sources. Again, this is at the bottom of this presentation. I've added a few websites that are credible websites that are known to be websites with accurate news and information. So check your websites, check your sources. Finally, is it a joke? Is someone trying to be funny? If someone's mocking, trying to be funny, don't believe it. We have a show here in the United States. It's called The Daily, and it's a news show, but it's supposed to be funny. Well, it's not a news show, and unfortunately, some people think it is. It's actually a show. So if it's a joke, it may not be true. And finally, most importantly, ask experts. All of you have contact sources. Don't be afraid to call them, chat them, email them, WhatsApp them, Facebook Messenger them, whatever, but get back to your sources. Okay, again, this is just really to reiterate, what can you do now to stop the flow of disinformation and misinformation? Rely on verified information, question statistics, models, and polls. Again, this has become extremely controversial in the United States, the use of models that have proven to be wrong. So there were predictions in March that many, many more people would have died of coronavirus. They have not, based on models. I'm not saying you should just ignore models, but I think you need to be really clear and explain to your readers and your listeners where the models came from and how they were derived as much as you can. Call the experts. This is just repeating what we said earlier. And my number one recommendation, stop feeding the clickbait. When you see something provocative online, on Twitter, on Facebook, hold the phone, put your finger away from the send button. Make sure you're not spreading disinformation. What can you do now? Continued. Check, if you're looking at a website, check the URL. If the URL has something odd, like buzz, B-U-Z-Z, very careful. Do not spread false websites. Go to the About page. Again, you need to find out who's putting a website out and who they are. Number 3, is the story too crazy? Again, is it a joke? And number 4, think before you send. One of the encouraging things that's happened as a result of a huge disinformation and misinformation campaigns has been that the global social media platforms have actually done quite a good job of trying to halt disinformation. Google, Facebook, Twitter have all upped their, and Facebook obviously also controls WhatsApp and Instagram, but they've really gone into overdrive, added people, and tried to identify information that is wrong, that is hateful, that is provocative and not true, and also to provide sites that include accurate information about the virus. So I've just listed a couple of sites, 5 sites that I think are go-to sites for journalists, particularly as they're looking at health news. Number 1, I mentioned earlier, was Johns Hopkins University. This is an American, premier American university with a major medical school and also a major health information unit. So that's one site. The second is obviously the World Health Organization. There's been some controversy about It's statistics, but they still are reputable. They are vetted. There is controversy about them. There has been, but in general, I think they're good. There's our own US CDC site. The Centers for Disease Control is the leading authority in the United States on health information and news. And they are an excellent site for statistics, for trends, for cures, for anything that's going on. And finally, both Facebook and Twitter, I think, have started some excellent COVID-19 sites. I go to them every day. They map out new developments. They're trying to make sure that that the users of Facebook and Twitter, of which all of us are getting the right information. And I think they're doing a good job. So let's look at fact checking. And I'm delighted to see that Mongolian journalists have really moved into the world of fact checking. You have your own site, your own fact checking site that many of you have participated in. I know that this site was originally set up as a fact check for elections, but has been used for other reasons, including coronavirus. So that's really a positive development, because fact checking and fact-checking sites have they've proliferated in the United States because there's been so much disinformation, and they tend to be very good. So I've just listed here a couple of the fact-checking sites that you might want to look at if you're looking for stories that have been debunked. First Draft News is actually a consortium that's run by Google. It's based in the United Kingdom. And they have daily fact-checking information, and they debunk stories. Your very own Fact Check Mongolia, which I think is great, and really puts Mongolian journalists in touch with a lot of people around the world. The Week in Fact Checking is put out by the Poynter Institute, and I recommend you look at this site. The Poynter Institute is the premier journalism education center in the United States. It's not a university, it's not a school, it's basically an organization that supports current journalists with training. They have a lot of online training opportunities. They're doing a lot of fact checking. It's a great site and a great organization. ICFJ, I hope all of you are familiar with the International Center for Journalists. Again, in the United States, the premier group that really supports journalists worldwide. They do training, they have really up-to-date websites, and they've jumped into the fact-checking bandwagon with both feet. Fact Checking Day is another site. And finally, if you look at the very bottom, one of my favorites is the News Literacy Project. And this is a project that started in the United States to try to provide curriculum to young people to learn how to be educated media consumers, to be critical thinkers, to understand that there are different points of view from different media, and you need to read a lot of media and listen a lot and think about what's happening. So this is a great site. Finally, questions and answers. This isn't a live session, but I would love to hear from any of you. I will make sure that everybody has my email, my WhatsApp number, my Facebook page, and I look forward to any of your questions. Finally, this is our organization, our agency. We are funded by the US government. Our mission is to inform, engage, and connect with people around the world, and as well to support freedom and democracy. Thank you very much.